certain universal rights that extended beyond the rights of citizens. And I read that from the notes. I took that from the notes. That's one. The second thing that we recognize is the notion, and this becomes very important in the contemporary debate, and I'll get into this in a second, the notion of three things. Right? The first thing is freedom. The next thing is liberty. And lastly, we have equality. So freedom, liberty, and equality were seminal in the development of human rights as a concept, right? So before we get to the development of human rights as a concept, we have to recognize the importance of these three ideas. The idea of freedom, the idea of liberty, and the idea of equality. Now, roughly speaking, very roughly, I'm not going to get all philosophical. For those of you who have watched my lectures, you know we can complicate these terms and make these terms profoundly complex. But generally speaking, when we're talking about the idea of freedom, we view it in a very vague sense as an ability to choose between two different things, right? I find myself at a path. I have the ability to choose option 1 or option 2. Roughly, we can generally describe that as freedom. The idea of liberty, especially developed out of the law of nations, is almost inextricably bound to the notion of freedom, right? An individual liberty, right? An individual liberty introduces sort of this idea of right, and I'll get into a deeper discussion on that in a second. But this idea of liberty, especially in a contemporary sense, means that the individual in and of him or herself has a certain autonomous mode of being, to be technical, right? The individual is an autonomous agent within a larger socio-political, economic, familial structure. And that individual's autonomy, right, liberty, this individual's autonomy should be respected. It should be acknowledged, right? And again, I want this to be very, very general. So just sort of generally we can think of autonomy, right? Now, obviously, these are all profound generalizations. You know, we can critique and analyze these, but you guys know who watch me, I always start with a bit of ghetto philosophy. What does that mean? Keep the ideas and concepts very boring, very general, very introductory, and as we go further and further in the series, we'll complicate the ideas with jargon and more profound, more complex, intricate assessments. But right now, let's just keep it very simple. And then lastly, the idea of equality. Right? And the idea of equality, there are actual two conceptions that I'll be discussing throughout. I'm not going to get into too much detail at this point, but sort of two senses of the word equality. Right? We have equality as a priori, right? A priori equality, mathematical equality. And when we're talking about equality, if we say something like A is equal to A, well, obviously, well, I can't say obviously, but this is known as a tautology. Nothing important that you need to memorize, but, and it's basically true by definition. It's sort of the technical way of defining it. So if I say something is equal, what I'm saying is the truth of this claim, the fact that it is equal, is true by definition, right? And this is known as the a priori in a very general sense. I don't want to get into too much information on that, but I mean, just common sense is A equals A. The other type of equality that we can be talking about that specifically pertains to human, and for those philosophers of you, we philosophers know that there are more forms of equality, but I'm not going to get into that. The other type of equality that we can be talking about has a sense to do with identity, right? In a sense. And what we're trying to say are that human beings are roughly the same, right? Human beings are roughly the same. So that if I talk about the distinction between a man and a woman, or between races, quote unquote, which we all know don't exist, or between classes, which we know have been socially constructed, there really is no distinction, right? As inherent, remember, we're talking about inherency, right? We're talking about universal, do I still have it up? I erased it. Remember, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this is a universal characteristic. Now, with that being said, it's important to recognize that, at least from my standpoint, other people will disagree with me probably profoundly on this, but it's my lecture series, so I'm going to teach it the way I want to teach it. I personally don't believe in human nature. This is just me. I don't believe that there is this thing called human nature that sort of, all human beings have, or, I don't believe in human nature. I do believe in the concept of freedom, liberty, and equality, and I believe that those concepts are bound, right? They're sort of the preconditions, if you will. So all of these concepts become the preconditions, right? All of these concepts become the preconditions to human rights, but the idea then to say that these preconditions are in some sense part of a nature requires a far more complex discussion than I'm willing to go into at this point, because to be technical, and I'll just stop at this point because I don't want to start losing you, but for those of you who know, this idea of a human nature assumes some type of teleological end, and my interpretation of the natural sciences is precisely that there isn't an end. There is an unfolding, but it is not intentionally, willfully directed towards some functionality or some end. So I don't believe personally in human nature. So I think you can talk about human rights. I will talk about human rights without also sort of evoking human nature. Okay, the next is the natural law. Right, so the natural law, and within antiquity, we're going to make an emphasis between rights and duties, right? So a number of things. When I, in the lecture series, talk about and I won't really come back to this idea of the natural law too much, but when I do talk about the idea of the natural law, you can think of it in terms of, on a superficial level, sort of the natural law as defined by what's known as an inference to the best, right? An inference to the best explanation, right? When we talk about the natural law, we're talking about, at least I'm going to be articulating it within the context of what science really is, which is an inference, right? It's a mode of assessing and interpreting what is, right? So it's an inference to the best explanation. So we can use Darwinian theory to talk about the laws of predation and survival, biological mutation, and so on. We can talk about Newtonian physics to talk about the situatedness between ourselves here on the planet relative to some other point, and so on. Right? So that there are laws, and we all know this from general biology and general math, we all know that there are laws governing the structure of our reality. Right? The question is, how in the world did we get from a discussion of human rights to talking about science? Right? What is the connection? And without going to do a whole historical spiel, obviously the scientific enlightenment, especially post-scientific enlightenment, had a huge, I would go so far as to say some German idealists, specifically Immanuel Kant, in his formulations of many things, recognized this and gave sort of viability, along with John Stuart Mill and sort of the founders of the United States, recognized the viability that there seems to be, right? There seems to be scientific justification for the rights that individuals have, right? Based on the idea that we accept the existence of freedom, human autonomy, and equality. All of those things serve as foundations for an understanding of human rights. All right, so with that then, we can really talk about sort of the relationship between rights and its counterpart. It's very, very, very critical that you recognize